This is a Labour Lives interview, and I'm in the constituency office of Gisela Stuart MP. Thank you for speaking to Labour Lives. Can I ask you, first of all, how you got involved in the Labour Party? You were originally born in Germany, so a short backstory would be useful for the Labour Lives interview and archives.
I always say I blame Chef Rooker's mother and Lucas Industries for that. I was doing research into pension laws, and in particular the powers of trustees, and this was early 1990s. And it was at that stage when Lucas Industries took 200 million out of its pension fund without increasing the benefits to the occupational pensioners. 120 million of that went straight to the Treasury, and 80 million went back to the company. And Jeff Rooker's mother was one of the pensioners, or was part of that group, who actually took the company to court. And what had happened is that the judge found against the pensioners and said, and if you appeal against the decision, I will award costs against you. And I had been involved with the Electoral Reform Society, and that's how I had known Jeff. And the pensioners kind of wanted to have this experience in the public domain in some stage. So I remember driving to Faisley to pick up all the court papers. And in a sense, the more I was working on my thesis, this unfinished PhD at Birmingham University, it wasn't clear who owned surpluses and all these things. It became clearer and clearer to me that women's pension rights, which were always related to earn taxable income, a whole lot of things which I thought were wrong. And then you make the next natural step, which is, well, I can either write a beautiful thesis, but actually the law needs changing. And so I came into politics, very late. I was in my mid-30s by then, and in a rather odd route. But again, I thought, being German, first past the post, there was no way I could actually enter Parliament in that sense. But I stood for the 1994 European election, because there was a right to be German. Well, I could stand because after Maastricht I was allowed to stand, European nationals were, but by common consensus, given that I lost by 0.5% and the polling day was 3 days after VE Day, it probably did cost me the election being German. On that polling night in 1994, Labour took a lot of seats and mine was the first one, which we didn't take. But then there was a classic example of, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Because with hindsight, it actually was the best thing that could have happened to me, which is to lose that European Union election. But having been a credible candidate, I then was looking for a parliamentary seat, and in the run-up to 97, an all-woman shortlist, it meant that suddenly all kinds of seats were won by Labour, which normally wouldn't win. Which of course doesn't yet ask you a question, why Labour? Which is the one question I can never answer, because it never occurred to me for it to be anything else. But I do have to confess, if I'd entered politics in the mid-80s, I would have been SDP. I mean, I'm at heart a continental social democrat. And I think, sort of also jumping to today, I still think there is a lost tribe of the Social Democrats. They're kind of splintered, and I quite often look at, there was Charles Kennedy at the Lib Dems, there's Andrew Adonis with us, there is people like Chris Grayling, Andrew Lansley in the Tory party. So there is a strand of centre-left Social Democrats who actually can be found in all the three main political parties.
Well, that's really interesting, because you then get selected in 1997 to fight Edgbaston, Birmingham Edgbaston, a seat that had always been held by women for the last sort of 40 years. And that was an interesting selection meeting, because I've had the opportunity of speaking to Councillor John Clancy, who was part of the selection, part of the constituency Labour Party at that time. And how did you feel going into that selection? Did you think you had a really good chance, or because it was said to be by Councillor Clancy to be a good, very powerful all-women list?
Now that we're kind of almost 20 years on, that in politics you should always only speak the truth, but not necessarily always the truth at the time, if you see what I mean. Silence is the kind mediator. So it's interesting that was the story, because I can now kind of tell the whole awful truth of this selection meeting, because I had absolutely no intention of winning Edgbaston. I'd made a strategic decision, which was my children were small, so I did not want to go for the seat where they went to school, which would have been Worcester would have been the natural place for me to go. I decided not to. It had to be away from where they were going into primary and secondary school at that stage. So then there were a number of seats in the West Midlands which were potential. Stourbridge, Tamworth, Edgbaston. And the links I had coming out of the European election were actually in Stourbridge. So Stourbridge was the seat which I thought I will go for. But in the meantime, Edgbaston comes up on the list of all-women shortlist as one of the earliest ones to do that. So I thought, well, trial run, let's go for that. My link with Edgbaston was nothing other than I was registered to do a PhD at the university. I could not establish any contact with anybody. Harborne branch invites me, and the hustings of the Harborne branch is then a dead heat. 2 candidates, same votes. So they send us out. They say, we're going to ask each one of you the same question, and then we're going to have another vote. So we come in and we asked about our views on electoral reform. And I said, look, folks, I've kind of nailed my colours on the mast there. I joined the Electoral Reform Society 10 years before I joined the Labour Party. So, some of you may not like that, but actually that's where I am. The other young woman apparently made the case of for and against, and people actually didn't like that. So even the ones who weren't in favour of electoral reform voted for me because I gave them a clear answer. So at that moment I had 1 nomination from Harborne, so it meant I was on the shortlist. And there was the main selection meeting. There was a rule that you had to be on time. If you weren't there at the beginning, you that was it. So I was driving up from Worcester. I had misread the letter, and I slightly took a wrong turning, and it meant that I arrived with 2 minutes to spare. And again, at that moment, you've got a choice. You can go in there and say, oh, by the way, I misread the letter and I took a wrong turning, but I want to be your MP, which I don't think is a very good opening for a job application. So I just came in and said I had not intended to cut it quite as fine as this, which was perfectly true. And I still did not, and I kid you not, I still at that point did not know a single person in the room. There were 5 candidates. And I thought, if I give a speech about local conditions, if I give a speech about potholes and refuse collection, people will ask me about potholes and refuse collection, of which I knew nothing. So I'd actually given a abridged version of Tony Blair's Clause 4 speech to the special conference. When I run the world tomorrow, this is what I'm going to do. And I got the nomination. And it taught me a number of things. It taught me, and I very often use this as an example when young people come and say, what do I have to do? I want to become an MP. I say, being in the right place at the right time is absolutely essential. And never stop yourself from anything because you say, oh, I haven't met those conditions. And of course, with hindsight, Edgbaston and I were a match made in heaven. What I also did not know, and if I had known that, I would not have even tried for the seat, that this was Neville Chamberlain's old constituency. I only found that out about 3 months afterwards, after I got elected, that this was Neville Chamberlain's old constituency. because I would have thought at the time, there was an audacity about that which I really didn't quite like. And particularly, you've got to remember 97, the fact that I was German did matter. And I these days use it as an example when I talk to students. I say to them, the world can change for the better. And I have these imaginary conversations with Neville Chamberlain in 1938, and essentially it says, in 1997, your seat's going to be represented by a woman, a socialist, one born near Munich, but don't worry, it's all democratic.
You did a law degree at London University. Did you ever think of practising?
Yes, I would have. I mean, I did it was the external programme, so because it allowed me to combine having small children and doing the law degree, and I would, for some lectures, go down to London. Some I literally would do on my own. Others I would go to Worcester Tech and join lectures with other people. And I then started actually teaching law. And the point of doing the PhD was I really took to trust law. And if I hadn't gone into politics, I probably would have stayed as a trust lawyer.
Many years ago, the House of Commons was stuffed with lawyers. Less so nowadays, I would suggest. Do you think that, in fact, being a lawyer gives you an advantage?
Well, if you say what is the job description of an MP, it is a lawmaker. So it gives you a head start.
Let's take you to the election campaign. Obviously, 97 was a very good year for Labour, but nevertheless, most people didn't think Birmingham Edgbaston would go Labour, did they?
No, they didn't, but they would have thought of the old Edgbaston. There was a change to the Edgbaston constituency boundary. It took in the ward of Bartley Green, and that then made it a potential Labour seat. And what has happened in this constituency, the electorate by and large makes a very clear distinction between local elections and national elections. So I have had periods where my 12 councillors were all Tories, and that's when there always came this thing, on the projection, she's gone. And 97, this was if there was going to be a Labour landslide on the scale we experienced, then this was a natural part of the landslide. So I came in with the tide. 2001, I stayed with the tide. 2005, I should have gone out with the tide, logically, if that would have been the swing. And you could just about sort of say, 2005, Stourbridge, which was roughly the same kind of seat, people thought we'd lose that, but we held it. The real crunch was 2010, when again, we can now be honest about these things, or more upfront about these things, that about a year before the election, a small group of us sat down and said, this is gone. I mean, we've lost this election. The way things are going, Edgbaston's going to go out. And we've got a simple choice of what we do now. We're either going to run a high noise, high profile campaign and go down with noise, street stores, all kinds of stuff we do. But we also know that this isn't the hard work which you have to do to win. Or we just sort of take a summer holiday right off Christmas and Easter, and any weekend between then, throw the rule book out and just run what we think to be the best campaign possible, and then we'll see what happens. But we didn't think we would win this, so we just did a whole lot of different things in terms of the vote ID, the way we did define the pool of who we would write to. There was one afternoon in February, which I remember, where I did the phoning, and you have to remember that I fight my entire election campaigns on the phone. I'm occasionally let out, but you define what only the candidate can do, and the candidate is the only one who can firm up doubtful voters or persuade people who are drifting away. And the most effective way of doing that is that over the phone. and the rest of the troops identify who needs to be talked to. So during that 2010 campaign, I made something like 1,200 phone calls. Each phone call would be followed up by a handwritten note. This was kind of high intensity work. And there was this one day where we had our gathering here, and I came back and I said, I can't believe what's going on out there. I've just talked to someone who used to be the chair of a Conservative association in Birmingham, who says, of course he's going to vote for me. Absolutely no question, because he didn't think the Tory candidates were up to it. I had a woman who delivers leaflets for us saying, of course she will go on delivering leaflets, but there's no way she can vote for me because she doesn't like Gordon Brown. And I had lifelong members of the Lib Dems who said, this is the first election, they're not putting up posters, they've just resigned from the party and they're going to vote for me because they can't stand Nick Clegg. And we sat there saying, there's something going on out there which we can't rationalise. So these notions of identifying the voter pool and these are our voters, we just said there's no such things. They've all become our potential voters because the old patterns don't work anymore. So we go into the election day and the count, fully expecting to have lost. Worcester had gone, Redditch had gone, all these seats had gone. So we said, well, we're gone too. It got to the point where, because the returning officers, you have to agree the figures. By about 1 o'clock, calls us over, and I look at the figures and I tried to work out how much I'd lost by, and I couldn't do the arithmetic, couldn't do the math, and I decided I was too tired. Till suddenly I sort of grabbed the returning officer's arm and said, "Are you trying to tell me I've won?" And he looked at me, so I was slightly unhinged, and he said, "Yes, you have." And this was, and you will see in my office a plate which David Cameron had to give me in 2010 when I got the Survivor of the Year award, because 2010 really was that case. Now 2015 was also a hard-fought campaign, and we each election we have done differently, and we've always fought our elections independent of the National Party. We've always done things differently here, but 2015 was doable. Whereas 2010, we did not think we could do it, but we pulled it off. That was the real cruncher. That was the breakthrough.
You talked about doing things independently. Are you sometimes a semi-detached member of the PLP in the fact that you are quite an independent person in terms of what you've said, your views about various things? How do you feel in the PLP? Are there natural alliances there that you've built up? Because you've talked earlier about people who were former members of the SDP and you're at heart a European Social Democrat. And I was interested because when you spoke about Baroness Thatcher in the House of Commons, you were extremely generous. Didn't need to be generous, but you were, and you spoke about women and strong women. Is that something that's important, do you think, not only to you, but do you think the electorate of Birmingham Edgbaston, that they see you somewhat differently from career politicians and have grown to like Gisela Stuart as Gisela Stuart, but also vote for you because you're in the Labour Party, but you've got a good personal vote?
I think you put it very well. It's a combination of these things. And I always say to people when they... in 2010 we also had the slogan which said, "I'm Labour, my values are Labour, but I think for myself." And I say to people, when you break rank with your own tribe, which I've only ever done big way once, you have to be very careful. You are damaging the brand in a sense. The notion, because some people have been looking at what we're doing here and they kind of think that independence mind is shown by voting against your own side. Well, look, you can't go out saying vote Labour, but by the way, I don't agree with the Labour Party on just about anything. However, we may have ended up with a leader who's just done that, who, Jeremy Corbyn didn't vote with Foot, he didn't vote with Kinnock, he didn't vote with Smith, he didn't vote with Blair, he didn't vote with Brown, and he didn't vote with Miliband. But let's park that for the moment. In terms of the local one, I think what people look for is two things. It's authenticity and candour. And I thought a very good example of this was this summer. We had a private member's bill in the autumn about assisted suicide. And there was no question that this would be whipped by the party in any way. And I had a view, but I needed to test that view. Was I right? And I held 2 public meetings which were absolutely fascinating, where on both of them, essentially, I just said, look, this is the bill. What do you think? Just tell me what you think. And at the end of that process, and at the end of that vote, even those people who would have wished me to have voted another way sent me a letter to thank me for the process. And I think this is the bit which the politicians very often overlook, is what our voters want is that we're honest with them, that we try to understand, that we do fight on their behalf, that even if we don't succeed, at least they would like us to fight for them. And if we don't, give them a reason why we don't. And it's that straightness, I think, in my relationship with the electorate which I've built up, which is helpful. However, when I do the kind of number crunching, because I think you need to go back, and their systems, their structures. Our strength here in Edgbaston is, Team GS, Gisela Stuart, the candidate. But with that goes a massive supporters network. Only about half the people who help with our campaigns are Labour Party members. Most of them care about their neighbourhood and their community. On polling day, we have a machinery that identifies the voters, brings them out, a well-run machinery. So underneath Gisela Stuart is probably on polling day another 500, 600 people who just do the work. But even with all that, I would say that you probably can't do more than about 6% of a swing. I think your perfect candidate, the perfect machinery, and the perfect opponent. Your opponent too has to be weak. I think 6% is about the swing you can withstand. After that, you do go with the party.
You talked about particular issues that you had fallen out with the Labour Party. Are we referring to Europe and their views about Europe?
Yeah,
where are you on there? Especially in the present circumstances, with the Prime Minister renegotiating or saying that that's what his position is. Could you share those views with us?
Well, you may have noticed that I've fallen silent. And I've always said to the Labour Party as well that the limits of my loyalty is silence. I will not go out and advocate things which I don't believe in. Then there are things which I can fall silent. And then just now and then there may be something which I feel so strongly about that I would not be silent. Now, currently, my view on the European Union is I am unbelievably angry that I'm being asked to vote in a referendum on a question which is meaningless, utterly, utterly meaningless, for no other reason than to keep the Prime Minister in his job, having been denied the chance to have a say on matters European when he would have been relevant. And actually, just as the Tories didn't give us a referendum on Maastricht, which they should have done, and Labour didn't give us a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, which they should have done, it's something parties in government do. And I just think it's sad. And I also think that in terms of the European Union, there's I use the phrase, I hear the ice cracking. We may be pretty sheltered in the UK at the moment. We are currently seeing the largest movement of people since the Second World War at the borders and inside the European Union, for which the European Union is utterly, utterly unprepared. And I kind of find it distressing beyond belief that we are sitting here in the UK arguing whether we should possibly even tinker with tax credits for 18 to 22-year-olds to allow the Prime Minister to be able to say, I've toughened up on benefits of members of the European Union, whilst we have got Sweden closing its borders, Germany having taken in 800,000 people, which they're not sure how to deal with. Whole structures are falling apart, and we are making demands on the machinery which are tinkering. So in terms of the European Union, currently I'm just really angry because yet again it's not a proper debate, and if there was a referendum tomorrow, I think I'd go and wash my hair.
In the early part of the Labour government, you did hold some office. You were parliamentary private secretary, and then I think in a couple of departments. Would that be right? Did you enjoy being close to power?
Yes, it is. However, the greatest power I ever exercised was when it was not obvious. I was a PPS to Paul Boateng in the Home Office, which was fantastic. And this is kind of examples. I introduced a change in one of the Criminal Justice Acts, which was minimal in terms of when you look at the law, but made huge difference to the constituency. Up to that point, curb crawling was a notifiable offence and not an arrestable offence. We made it an arrestable offence, which suddenly helped the police on the Hagley Road end and the Persia end, where we had real curb crawling problems, to deal with the difficulties. So the Home Office time was nice because I could see that with a small change in the law, you could really affect things on the ground. I was then a health minister for 2 years, and I mean, I was the evil witch, and really the abuse which was hurled at me at the time, because I closed down the military hospitals. The Royal Colleges were saying they're not safe anymore, we can't train doctors, the experience, they've got to come into the NHS. And then 10 years later to see that I closed them down, we brought the Centre for Defence Medicine to Birmingham. In Afghanistan, Camp Bastion, it was about the best hospital. You know, if you had a car crash in England and been asked which is the best hospital you'd like to go to, actually it would have been Bastion. Second, the QE. We've now got excellent stuff. So I set up NHS Direct. So it was good to see the difference you can make. And, you know, being the Edgbaston MP, health is something you can't ignore. But in terms of genuine power, after the 2001 election, they set up something called the Convention on the Future of Europe, which was meant to draft a European constitution. About 230 people came together to do that. But there was a small group of people who were the drafting body, which was grandly called the Presidium. And on that place, they had 3 places reserved for representatives of the national parliaments. And I went there to represent national parliaments. And that's really important because it meant that the whole UK... I was sitting right at the centre of the negotiations, but I did not represent government. I represented parliament, which allowed me, A, to do some things which the government didn't particularly want, but I'd say they were stronger for parliament. But the much more important thing is there's a very strange rule which says civil servants cannot advise the current government of what advice they gave the previous government. So when I dealt with the Foreign Office, there was what they call the veil of administration. However, because I represented Parliament and the Speaker's Council had been a lawyer in the Foreign Office during Maastricht, he could advise me. It meant I could go in and actually have a historic knowledge of the, as someone said, the kind of duds that sold major, which they were trying on again. And I was briefing the entire cabinet because this was across the range. So I would go from the Home Office to Defence to Fisheries and Agriculture to you name it, which almost, even as a cabinet minister, you never have that breadth all across. And in the final stages of negotiations, I literally would have sort of an open line into number 10 to say, this is where we're going. So in terms of power, I've probably never exercised so much power as I did then. And it was that which led me to this total disillusion with the project, because I just simply saw how this was just a political elite pushing things through and simply using the electorate as something to legitimize the decisions they had already made. So that was fascinating. If you'd asked me to do this again, I'd say absolutely not. Over my dead body. Would I miss this? Absolutely not. It was fantastic learning curve, 18 months of high-level negotiations. It was interesting. I learned a lot.
And Labour, of course, had a problematic election in 2005 as a result of perhaps the Iraq War and the difficulties. So there must have been problems for you personally and others in the Labour Party. What did you feel the Labour Party should have... If we could rewind the clock and go back to perhaps late 2002, should the Labour Party and the Labour government have been more open and more transparent in its discussions with the public? Because you seem to be on record as saying something about George W. Bush.
Once it's on Wikipedia, it is true.
Well,
again,
there you go.
But no. Actually, let's just. There are three parts of this question.
Yes.
First one, the George W. Bush one, is hilarious, and it's kind of once this is deemed to be out, then it's out, and that's it. What happened is I edit a political magazine called The House Magazine, and we were sitting there saying, wouldn't it be interesting if we get a Tory to support John Kerry, and we get a Labour MP to support George W. And we do a double spread, and I just thought it was a really good idea. So we had no problem finding a Tory supporting John Kerry, but of course there wasn't a single Labour MP who was going to support George Bush. And at that stage, they had a Telegraph columnist. I can't think of his name now, but he was sort of terribly right-wing. So we just said, well, why don't I do a mark, I can't remember what his name was, but essentially I was saying, why I think George will win, because, love him or loathe him, you know where you stand. And I was just going through and saying why I thought George W. would win. And that in itself was just, published, and nothing would have happened if it hadn't been for then an MEP issues this press release saying, former Labour minister supports George W. And then, of course, at that moment it gets viral. And then it's on Wikipedia. And at that moment, my advice to any politician out there is just live with it. Just leave it. It is, which is the one thing. Second, the other two questions you asked about Iraq and the European Union. I mean, the European Union Lisbon Treaty is absolutely clear to me. We should have held a referendum. End of story. Put it out there. Put it to the people. Done with it. Iraq, what was quite extraordinary was that Tony Blair, I think you need to understand how he ended up where he was. In 1998, he gave the Chicago speech, which outlined reasons for intervention. And if you go back, Bosnia was the kind of post-war generation which said, there has to come a point when you do intervene, and it's around duty to protect. And if you think about it, people have forgotten. In the heart of Europe, in Yugoslavia, 250,000 people had to die in front of our eyes before we finally went in, and we went in without a UN mandate. Easily forgotten. It was Clinton and Blair who decided to go in, and because it succeeded, and because so that was fine. And at that point, what he should have done about Iraq is had a completely different narrative which said, why now? Explain why now, which the narrative he could have made was first Gulf War, UN resolution after UN resolution, he's gassing the Kurds, which he was, we intervene and we do now because. And he didn't. He went down 20 minutes, weapons of mass destruction. If you go back, you will never ever find a single reference to weapons of mass destruction or 20 minutes in anything I've ever said. Because that was not... the reason why I voted for this was because this was, to me, the duty to protect, and the point where you do intervention. That was my reason for doing it. The fact that he'd lost his nerve and was going down some other route. And that, of course, then I think, undoubtedly there were a whole kind of mistakes made, dismantling the Iraqi forces, all kinds of things which were just horrendous. But again, I think that was the mistake. That was the big mistake, and it will haunt him for the rest of his life.
The House of Commons is supposed to be a great place for theatre, the set speeches and all the rest of it. Well, many people, of course, said that Tony Blair's speech about the Iraq War was one of the finest speeches that they'd actually heard in the House of Commons. We don't often hear that said since then. We have to go back in time to, say, 1940 and the Norway debacle and all the problems that Chamberlain then had. Who were the great beasts who are making great speeches that members of Parliament like yourself will think, hold it, he's speaking, I want to be in the chamber to hear? Who are the people that you think can still turn a phrase, make a great speech, and therefore perhaps change the voting patterns of some individuals? Or am I just a romantic?
No, you're not romantic, except that the occasions are by far fewer than we think. In my time in the House of Commons, the absolute master of the speech was William Hague, no doubt about it. And I even bought a CD recording of his second reading speech of the Lisbon Treaty. And I bought it because it's hilarious, it's funny. It's the one where he goes on about the presidents, where he goes and says, can you imagine, Gordon Brown's face as the cavalcade comes up and the Euro president drives up and the car comes out and there's Tony Blair coming out and then he has to say, Mr. President, and it is really funny. But the reason why I bought it is a reminder that the Jeremy Paxman phrase when he says, whenever I talk to a politician I wonder why is the bastard lying to me. I remember sitting in the chamber, and as he was getting funnier and funnier, I was sitting there saying, why is the bastard making me laugh? And he made me laugh for a reason, because it stopped. He didn't have to explain where the Tories were on this one. And he was a great orator. I mean, in terms of oratory, there's always the terrible conflation of great orators and demagogues. Of which George Galloway is your supreme example. Nasty, unpleasant demagogue, but compelling, absolutely compelling when you're in the presence of the speech, and you, because it has kind of an energy which most English people actually think there's something slightly wrong about it. It's the Welsh and the Scots which speak with much greater passion and actually think that to have passion in the speech is appropriate. And you will find a lot of the new SNP people very, very interesting speakers in the way they present themselves and the way they make the case. But I find that, on the subject of Europe, for example, I've put a discipline on myself which says never, ever, ever stand up and give a speech unless you've got something new to say. Because there's some subjects where essentially I can go into the debate and I can tell you exactly what everybody's going to say, and that's kind of pointless. And the Commons as a chamber for persuasion has changed enormously. Decisions are happening. Democracy, the space in which democracy happens, has moved, and it's happening somewhere else. And that's a challenge for us as MPs. You
made a comment in the House of Commons about women in politics, and about how the Labour Party brought women into politics, and there obviously, in your view, should be perhaps more women in politics. Is it a very women-friendly place? It strikes me, as looking at it from the outside, perhaps the hours are better than they used to be, but it looks a pretty unfriendly place, and it must be pretty tough for women in the House of Commons.
Well, I have really bad news for you. It's pretty tough for men too. It's may have a slightly different angle to this. If I wanted a 9-to-5 job, I wouldn't have gone into politics first. I did there's nothing more wonderful than talking to children, because they ask you interesting questions and devastating questions. And last week I had Bartley Green School down, and a little boy gets up and says to me, "Why do you guys talk about things? Why don't you just make decisions?" It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And then you can say, well, that may be more effective, but actually just making decisions would be dictatorship. And we talk about things because you've got to keep testing whether I'm doing the right thing, and that's the nature of democracy. You keep testing your argument, and then at some stage you've got to say yes or no. So the House of Commons is not like a sort of continental Catholic iterative process of divining the right answer because you believe there's the right answer out there, and if you only talk about it long enough. The House of Commons is to say there's an appropriate solution at a given time which we think is the best answer to the current situation, and the nature of the debate is you keep testing it. And you mentioned sitting hours, for example. There is something of an exercise of power over long sitting hours. If you're in opposition, the only thing you can do is keep the government guessing, and you can keep the government guessing that they've got to keep their people on the benches every hour until you've decided to pull stumps. So there's a point to all this, and there's a point to the shouting. There's a point to the argument, and I can tell you one thing: when people say it's too noisy in the chamber, my view is that when you're a minister, there's nothing more disturbing than when your side is silent. People behind you are silent. You know you're dead. So, and that sort of, should there be more women? Yeah, there should be more women. There should be a reflection of the population at large. There should be the young. There should be the old. There should be the rich. There should be the poor. But in terms of just women, I keep saying the minute we've got as many useless women in the place as we've got useless men, we've reached equality.
One of the problems of the House of Commons is the not only the hours, but the fact that people are away from home. There's the death of the late lamented Charles Kennedy, who you spoke about. Did he pay a price for being someone who was a long way from home, or did he just have a particular problem which others might also have?
I mean, Charles was in the end, he was drinking heavily, he was an alcoholic. He would be the first one to say that. Alcoholism is not restricted to politicians. But, in the modern world, the vast number of professionals these days live pretty sort of ambulatory lifestyles. Working away from home is not limited to MPs. We know what it is. I know it's a Sunday night to Thursday. That's not the problem. I think Charles was someone who paid the price for having everything so young. He was leader of his party. He was. Where do you go after that? But yes, it's a tough life. But when people, for example, say about working hours in London, I don't particularly want to finish at 7 on a Tuesday. I rarely get home before 11 anyway, because then I work in my office. Because actually, I'm not in London to have a social life. I'm in London to work. So I work.
Could I move you on to Birmingham politics, if you're prepared to talk about it? Yeah. Just very briefly.
No, it's okay. We've got 15 minutes and then I've got to go to Simpsons, yeah?
Thank you very much. Well, perhaps, Gisela Stuart, I can talk to you then about Birmingham City Council, just briefly, if you'd like to comment. There is now a leadership election going on. Sir Albert Bohr has resigned. He will stand down on the 1st of December. We have the Kerslake report, we have the improvement panel, we've had commissioners in, there may be more commissioners. What do you think's gone wrong with Birmingham City Council?
Let me first say what's gone right, and then we look at what's gone wrong. What's gone right is so much that because it is a city that can offer everything, unlike other places which can say, well, we've got a great ballet, we've got a great this, we've got... In Birmingham, you literally, you name it, we've got it. I can find it. Therefore, it kind of got to a point where it failed to even define itself. It regarded its superiority as a self-evident truth, and it regarded it as self-evident that any good ideas, we had them. That we couldn't learn anything from anybody else. And every time that was challenged, they were saying, well, we're that much bigger. And kind of size was deemed to be a problem. And that was just wrong. So what you've got now, you've got a position where you're suddenly facing pressures on every level. You've got, on the one hand, a demography which is 40% of the population under the age of 25, 30% under the age of 15. The jobs, and this is something where Albert has been absolutely brilliant in terms of regeneration and bringing in jobs, but a lot of those actually weren't jobs which would be filled by the young people of Birmingham, and we've seen increase in regional commuting and New Street Station, so it doesn't address the problem. We had Tim Brickhouse in the 90s doing enormous good work on education, which would have taken us to a space where, given that demography also changed, but somehow they didn't manage to fill that vacuum after Brickhouse. And they lived off the Brickhouse success for a number of years, but did not face up to what happened to the rest of education. And on top of that, a process by which you've got a Tory government that managed to con people to think that by calling things like powerhouse, they're not actually reducing the role of local government almost to its statutory duties. So Birmingham, which has always been more dependent on central government funding, when they pull the rug from under their feet, will hurt so much more. You didn't have that combination of what Albert had when he was last time the leader, and he would have it now with Mark Rogers again, but it's almost coming in too late, of a leader and a chief executive, that there's a healthy tension that one comes in where the others, and that suddenly left Birmingham in a position where they're really struggling. And we should have had a directly elected mayor, because I think that would have mettled whoever ended up winning that process into a leadership position. Because I compare this to what Roy Jenkins once said about the Home Office, the Home Office before the part of the Ministry of Justice. He said the Home Office, unlike any other office, you have to almost deal like a medieval baron. You are in charge of a group of very strong individuals. It's not that you're in charge of the Home Office. You're in charge of your 5-6 ministers who are very strong, who are running the various bits of the Home Office. And that's where Birmingham is now. It actually requires a group of very, very strong politicians who then are led by one of them. And that kind of, we have not succeeded in bringing on a generation of strong people who form a group to run the city. And that's the challenge which we've got. And, to be fair, if you read the Kerslake report, Kerslake spells out pretty clearly what we need to do.
And Birmingham City Council leadership should buy into it wholly.
I think they have bought into it, but the one thing they keep, the commissioners keep coming back, it is the style of leadership. And because of Birmingham, it requires more than just one person. It actually requires a team. And whoever is the leader that gets elected, if they're going to be successful, they have to realise that it's not about them, it is about their ability to bring on others, and they have to show some decent track record of being strong team players. And when I employ people in my office, my first criteria is a very straightforward one. They've got to be able to do something which I can't do, i.e. I surround myself with people who've got strength which I haven't got. And that's what the next leader of Birmingham City Council needs to do.
There are 5 candidates. Have you got a preference?
I have one.
You prepared to reveal it?
No.
Could I ask you one final question to perhaps correct what appears to be a common view, which is that Sir Albert Bohr wouldn't have gone but for a seismic event. That seismic event was Councillor James Mackay resigning in the terms that he did. Did he discuss with you his resignation from the cabinet? He's a councillor in your constituency and is believed to be close to you.
James did what James always does, is he sits down, he doesn't do things on impulse, he thinks about it carefully, and then he tells me what he's about to do. But at the point when he's doing it.
Gisela Stuart, thank you for speaking to Labour Lives.
Pleasure.